The sun was bleeding out over Red Hollow, spilling fire across the plains. Wind pushed the dust into long, twisting ribbons that caught the dying light and turned the air the color of rust. Out of that haze came a creaking wagon, the kind that belonged more to ghosts than men. Clyde Marin sat at the reins, a half-empty bottle of whiskey resting between his knees. He was a man the land had already chewed up, weather-worn, unkempt, and mean in the eyes. Behind him, bound loosely with a strip of cracked leather, was a girl, an Apache girl, barely 19. Her name was Apache. The wind caught her black hair and whipped it across her face, but she didn't flinch. Her wrists were raw where the rope rubbed, yet she stood straight in the wagon bed, her posture defiant, silent, and proud in a way Clyde could never understand. When the wagon stopped, dust swirled around the tall fence of a sprawling ranch. Beyond it stood a man with shoulders like carved oak and a face carved by grief more than time. Amon Thorne, ranch owner, widower, a man who lived with ghosts. His land stretched to the horizon, fields of brittle grass, weathered barns, and a single chimney coughing out smoke. Clyde spat in the dirt, then grinned that slimy, crooked grin that always came before trouble. "Evening, Thorne," he said. "Got something we talked about." He tugged on the reins of the chestnut stallion tied behind him. The horse stamped the ground, muscles rippling under a coat of dust and light. "Strong beast," Clyde added, "worth every damn penny, and I'm throwing in the girl." Amon's gaze lifted, not to the horse, but to the girl standing behind the wagon. Akacheta met his eyes for just a second, and in that heartbeat something wordless passed between them. Pain recognizing pain. "What's her story?" Amon's voice was low, gravelly, the kind that carried more weariness than threat. Clyde shrugged, pretending not to care. "Hell if I know. Some tribe east of here. Lazy as a cat in the sun, but she works if she's told. You'll get your worth out of her." "So, the horse for the girl. That's what we said." The silence that followed stretched thin as wire. Wind hissed through the fence boards. A hawk cried somewhere overhead. Then Amon reached into his coat, pulled out the folded reins, and handed them over. "The horse is yours," he said simply. Clyde grinned, already climbing onto the saddle. "Pleasure doing business, Thorne. She don't talk much. Too quiet, if you ask me." He tipped his hat mockingly at the girl before spurring the horse into motion. The stallion kicked up a storm of red dust as they rode off, leaving behind the smell of sweat, liquor, and cheap victory. Akacheta stood in the road long after the sound of hooves disappeared. For the first time since dawn, she exhaled. "You can come inside," Amon said at last, voice calm but firm. "You'll need a roof before night hits." She followed him toward the ranch house, her bare feet stirring up the dry earth. The porch creaked under their weight. Inside, the place was simple but clean. Wooden floors scrubbed to pale grain. A small fire flickering in the stone hearth. The smell of coffee and smoke thick in the air. He nodded toward the basin. "There's water there. Supper's on the table if you're hungry." Akacheta said nothing. Her throat felt tight from days of silence. She placed her bundle on the floor, just a wool blanket, a bone pendant, and a strip of painted leather tied with feathers. She stood near the doorway, unsure if she was meant to sit or stand. Amon poured himself a tin cup of coffee. "Didn't ask for this," he murmured, half to himself. "Didn't ask for a horse either, but what's done is done." He looked up again. "You got a name?" She hesitated, the Apache syllables catching on her tongue. "Akacheta," she said finally. "Akacheta," he repeated slowly, letting the sound settle in the room. "You can stay here, long as you pull your weight. I don't keep prisoners." Something in the way he said it, steady, unthreatening, made her chest loosen just enough for breath. She nodded. "Yep, sir." He frowned. "Don't call me sir, just Amon." He went back to his coffee. The fire popped softly, echoing in the silence. That night, Akacheta lay on a narrow cot in the small side room he'd cleared for her. The walls were thin. Through the cracks, she could hear the moan of the wind and the restless cry of coyotes. Her eyes wandered to the flicker of firelight beneath the door. For years, she'd lived with fear as a companion. Fear of men, of night, of her own voice. But Amon Thorne hadn't raised his hand, hadn't shouted, hadn't looked at her like property. Not yet. She turned toward the window where the desert sky stretched endless and black, pricked with stars. The sound of the wind sliding over the land felt almost like a song, low, mournful, and old as the soil itself. Akacheta closed her eyes, and for the first time since she could remember, she didn't pray for escape. She only prayed the man beyond that wall would stay the way he seemed, quiet, steady, and merciful. Outside, the last streak of daylight burned over the plains, painting the dust gold before fading into night. Two lives, one bartered, one burdened, had just crossed paths in a land where mercy was rarer than rain. And in that cruel, red country, something fragile had begun to breathe. Morning came the way it always did in the desert, sudden and gold. The smell of coffee filled the air before the light even touched her window. When she stepped outside, Amon was already by the barn, sleeves rolled, rope in hand. The horses stirred, restless from the night wind. She hesitated, unsure if she should approach. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "Feed's in the bin. Buckets by the door. You can start there." She worked in silence, clumsy at first, but careful. The horses were big, nervous things. One snorted at her scent, another pawed the dirt. But when she started humming low in her throat, a tune her mother used to sing during storms, they stilled. Amon glanced up from where he was mending a gate. "You talk to him?" She shrugged. "Only the ones that listen." He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. But there was something like curiosity flickering behind his eyes. Hours passed, sun climbing high and hard. Sweat streaked her neck. Dust clung to her hands, but for once, she didn't mind the ache. Work here didn't taste like punishment. It felt real, like putting pieces of herself back together, one nail, one breath at a time. By late afternoon, she wandered into the barn again, drawn by the quiet smell of hay and wood. That's when she saw it, half buried in dust near an old tack box, a small wooden horse, scorched black at the edges, its legs chipped but still standing. She picked it up, brushing off the soot with her sleeve. The carving was rough but full of care, the kind of work done by someone who loved more than they said. She didn't hear Amon until his shadow filled the doorway. "You found that," he said quietly. She turned, startled, nearly dropping it. I didn't mean to." "It's all right." His gaze stayed fixed on the toy, not her. "My boy made it. Before the fire." The word fire seemed to steal all the sound from the barn. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air smelled of dust and sorrow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, eyes far away. "Most folks don't know, and I don't much tell it." He walked out into the yard, his figure framed by the sinking sun, shoulders broad but bowed under something invisible. Akacheta watched him go, the toy horse still warm in her hand from where his eyes had lingered. That night she sat by the small fire in the kitchen, mending an old cloth just to keep her hands busy. The light flickered against the walls, painting gold across the rough wood. Outside, the coyotes sang their lonely chorus to the moon. When Amon came in, he paused at the sight of her. She half expected him to tell her to sleep or move, but he only nodded once, poured himself coffee, and sat at the table. The silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. It had softened, settled, like the air after a storm. He finally said, "You did good work today." She looked up, surprised. "Thank you." Amon gave a small grunt that might have been approval, then went back to his drink. When he rose to leave, the floor groaned beneath his boots. He stopped at the doorway, glanced back, and said, "Get some rest. Wind's gonna be rough tonight." She smiled faintly. "The wind's always rough." He gave a ghost of a smile. "Then you'll fit right in." Later, when the lamps went dark and the night wrapped around the ranch, Akacheta lay awake listening to the moan of the wind through the walls. It wasn't a lonely sound anymore. It was something older, something that belonged to the land, and maybe now to her too. Somewhere in another room, she could hear the slow, steady creak of Amon's chair as he sat near the fire. Two lives separated by walls and ghosts, but breathing the same air. And as the wind howled like a song from long ago, she thought, maybe silence wasn't empty after all. Maybe it was just another way the heart learned to speak. Days rolled into weeks, the kind that came and went without much notice. Sunrise, chores, dust, and the slow hum of wind through the grass. Out here, time didn't pass. It just stayed, heavy and endless. Akacheta rose before dawn, same as Amon. She learned which fence posts creaked, which gates stuck, which horse kicked when you came too close. Her hands, once soft from sewing in silence, turned calloused, strong, and brown with sun. The ache in her shoulders became a familiar companion, an ache she didn't mind. The land taught her its rhythm, the whisper of dry grass before rain, the way clouds gathered low and gray along the ridge, the taste of metal in the air before a storm. Amon never said much, but he watched. He saw how she studied the sky, how she stopped to listen to the horses breathe. Sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, he'd catch her speaking softly to them in her Apache tongue. Words smooth as water, low as wind. The stallion, a proud black with one white eye, would lean toward her voice as if the sound itself eased him. One morning, Amon leaned on the fence, arms crossed, hat tipped low. "What do you tell them?" he asked. Akacheta didn't turn. She brushed the horse's neck and said, "That the wind still remembers kind men." He didn't answer. He just stood there for a while, the corner of his mouth twitching like he might say something, but didn't. From that day on, he left the barn doors open for her, the first time anyone had been allowed in there since the fire that took everything from him. The ranch began to change quietly. The grass, once trampled and tired, started to stand taller. The horses seemed calmer, easier to handle. Even the air around the place felt lighter, as if the ghosts that had hung there were finally at rest. Akacheta noticed it first, the way Amon's silence softened. He still spoke little, but when he did, his voice had less iron and more dust, worn but gentle. He started showing her things without explaining them. How to mend wire without cutting her hands, how to pack salt blocks so they wouldn't draw coyotes. It wasn't teaching, not exactly. It was trust, spoken through action. And Akacheta, she listened always. One evening she brought him coffee while he was sharpening tools near the porch. He nodded in thanks, took a sip, and said, "You've got a good hand with horses." She smiled faintly. "I grew up around them. My people said they were born from thunder." He raised a brow. "Thunder, huh? Guess that explains why mine never listen." Her laughter came small but real, the kind of sound that startled even her. Amon glanced over, caught the light of her smile in the dying sun, and looked away too fast. Something unspoken flickered between them. Not love, not yet, but something like recognition. Later that week, Amon rode into town for supplies, leaving her in charge. When he returned, the first thing he noticed was the smell. The barn no longer reeked of smoke and dust. It smelled of cedar and fresh hay. Inside, everything was neatly arranged. Saddles oiled, tools cleaned, the horses calm. And hanging from one of the rafters was a small charm made of feathers and bone, an Apache wind token. He stood there for a long while, hat in hand. When she came to the door, wiping her hands on her skirt, he asked, "What's that?" "A gift," she said, "to keep the restless spirits away." "You believe in those?" Her gaze lifted, steady and quiet. "I believe some things never leave a place, but they can be taught to rest." Amon's eyes softened. He didn't believe in charms, not really. But that night he didn't take it down. The days grew warmer, the air heavy with the scent of rain that never came. In the evenings they sat outside sometimes, Amon on the porch steps, Akacheta mending a torn saddle strap under the lantern glow. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It had become a shared kind of peace. Once she asked about the fire. He didn't speak right away. The night was still, except for the soft hum of crickets. "My wife loved the horses," he said finally. "Said they were the only ones who listened." He paused, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the horizon. "That night, lightning struck the barn. She went in after them. Took my boy with her. I got there too late." The words came rough, splintered, like something dug up from deep earth. Akacheta lowered her sewing, voice trembling. "The wind remembers them too, I think." He turned to look at her. Really look for the first time. In her face, he saw no pity, only understanding. He gave a small nod. "Maybe it does." After that, he spoke her name more often, sometimes calling her to supper, sometimes just to hear it in the air. "Akacheta," He said it right, the Apache way, each syllable clean and careful. It made something in her chest ache, a longing she hadn't felt since her mother's voice faded from memory. By midsummer, the land had settled into its rhythm again. Sun, sweat, and the hum of insects in the tall grass. The sky stretched wide, the color of old brass. Every now and then, Amon would ride out early, and when he returned, he'd find her singing low to the horses, her voice braided with the sound of wind. He'd stop a few yards away and listen, not because he understood the words, but because something in them made the world feel alive again. He never said it out loud, but he started believing the ranch was healing, same as him. And Akacheta, though she still kept her distance, felt it too. Between them, something had begun to take root. Not passion, not yet, but trust. The quiet kind, like a cactus flower blooming under the moon. Unseen by most, but fierce in its will to live. The storm came without warning, rolling in from the south like a dark tide, swallowing the stars and turning the air electric. One moment the ranch was silent under the silver moon. The next, wind howled through Red Hollow like a wounded beast. Amon was the first to hear it. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards trembling under his boots. In the distance, the sky cracked open, a flash of silver and fire. He caught the scent of rain mixed with dust, that sharp iron smell that said something bad was coming. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his coat and hat. From her window, Akacheta saw him running toward the barn, the lantern light flickering wildly in his hand. The storm was building fast, kicking sand and grit against the glass. She hesitated for barely a breath before she threw on her shawl and followed him out into the chaos. The wind hit her like a wall, full of dust and fury. Grit filled her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. She could barely see him through the sheets of sand and rain, just the faint glow of his lantern bobbing like a ghost in the dark. "Amon!" she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant, she saw him at the barn doors, fighting to tie them shut. The horses inside screamed and kicked, panic thick in their throats. She stumbled forward, her skirt whipping around her legs, boots sinking in mud that hadn't been there an hour ago. Her foot slipped on a slick patch of clay. She went down hard, palms scraping the wet earth. When she tried to rise, another gust knocked her sideways. Then a hand, strong, calloused, desperate, grabbed her arm. "You fool girl!" Amon's voice cut through the roar of the storm, deep and raw. "You'll get yourself killed out here!" Before she could answer, he pulled her against him, wrapping his heavy coat around her shoulders. Rain poured down, soaking them both, thunder rolling so close it rattled the ground beneath their boots. Inside the barn, the horses were wild-eyed and trembling, their nostrils flaring in fear. Amon shoved the door shut with his shoulder, then barred it with a beam of wood. The storm hammered against it like fists. "Stay back," he said, breath ragged. "They spook easy when the sky's angry." But Akacheta was already moving toward the nearest stall, whispering in her mother's tongue. Her voice was soft but sure, like a prayer carried through the rain. The horses stilled, their breathing slowing, ears twitching toward her voice. Amon watched, chest rising and falling, the lamplight catching the water on his face. "You got a gift," he said quietly. She shook her head, drenched hair sticking to her cheek. "No, they just listen when you don't shout." "I saw it." For a long time they stayed there, two soaked silhouettes amid the smell of hay and fear, the world outside tearing itself apart. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, merciless light, Akacheta saw his face clearly for the first time. The scar that ran from his temple to his jaw gleamed white against his tan skin. It wasn't ugly. It was human, carved deep by survival. His eyes, though, held a different kind of wound, one that hadn't healed since the fire. He looked down at her, rain dripping from his hat brim. "This land breaks those who care," he said, his voice a low rumble under the thunder. Akacheta's eyes didn't waver. "Then why are you still here?" Amon didn't answer. Maybe he couldn't. For a heartbeat, the storm seemed to hold its breath. Then thunder cracked again, so loud it felt like the sky itself had split open. The lanterns swayed, the shadows shifting over their faces, one marked by loss, the other by exile. She realized then that they weren't so different. Both had buried too much. Both had nowhere else to go. When the worst of the storm passed, Amon sank to his knees beside her, exhausted. The wind softened to a low moan, brushing through the cracks like a tired ghost. "You should go inside," he said quietly. She shook her head. "Not yet." So he didn't move either. They sat there in the dim light, the smell of wet earth filling the barn. He took off his coat, wrung it out, and draped it over her shoulders again. "You're half frozen." "I felt colder," she murmured. He gave a short, rough laugh. Barely there, but it made her chest ache in some strange way. When she looked up, his gaze was already on her. For a long, suspended moment, neither spoke. The storm outside was dying, but inside something else had just been born. Small, fragile, and dangerous as flame. He reached up, brushing mud from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. "You don't belong in storms like this." "Maybe I do," she whispered. "Maybe that's why I'm still here." Amon's breath caught. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead he stood, turning to check the stalls again, his hands trembling just enough to betray him. When the dawn finally came, the rain had stopped. Sunlight spilled through the cracks in the barn walls, painting everything gold. Apache woke curled under his coat, her back against a bale of hay. Her skin smelled of smoke, leather, and rain. Amon was at the door, silhouetted against the morning light, his hat low over his eyes. "You should change," he said without looking back. "You'll catch cold." She rose slowly, her legs stiff, her heart heavier than she wanted to admit. "You stayed all night," she said softly. He nodded. "Didn't seem right to leave." When she reached the doorway, she hesitated. "Why'd you pull me from the mud?" He turned his head slightly, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Because no one else would have." Outside, the land gleamed wet and new, as if the storm had washed the whole world clean. The fields shimmered in the light, every blade of grass alive again. Akacheta stood there for a long moment, feeling the sun on her face. For the first time, the wind didn't sound lonely. It sounded like it was listening. And in that quiet after the storm, both of them understood, without a single word, that the walls they'd built around their hearts had finally begun to crack. For a few short weeks, Red Hollow forgot how to roar. The wind gentled, the fences held, and the horses grazed in peace beneath a pale spring sky. Amon healed slow from the storm, a stiffness in his shoulders that refused to leave, but he moved with purpose again. Akacheta worked beside him, her voice soft when she sang to the horses, her laughter rare but real. The ranch breathed easier, as though it had been holding its breath for years. But peace never lasts long in a land that doesn't know mercy. It was mid-afternoon when Amon first heard the hooves. 3 sets, not one. The sound carried across the dry flats, heavy and uneven, like trouble limping home. He stepped off the porch, wiping his hands on his shirt, eyes narrowing against the sun. A plume of dust rose from the ridge road, and in its heart rode Clyde Marin, hat low, bottle dangling from his hand, and a grin that smelled like whiskey and blood. Beside him, 2 men rode with the look of drifters who sold their loyalty for coin. Akacheta was in the yard, hanging laundry on the fence when she saw them. The color drained from her face, but she didn't run. She stood tall, hands gripping the damp cloth, her braid whipping in the wind. Clyde reined his horse to a stop just beyond the gate. His voice was a gravelly rasp. "Well, ain't this a picture? My Apache girl playing house with a ranchman?" Amon stepped forward, calm but solid as a fence post. "You're drunk, Marin. Turn your horse around and ride out." Clyde's grin widened. "You don't tell me what's mine." She was sold fair and square. Amon's eyes went cold. "She's not yours." Those 4 words hit the air like gunpowder. The drifters shifted in their saddles, fingers twitching near their belts. Clyde's smile broke into a sneer. "That's so!" Amon didn't flinch. His voice dropped lower, steady as the desert wind. "You heard me." The stillness cracked. The first shot came from the man on Clyde's right. A flash of steel, a crack like thunder. The bullet tore through the porch post inches from Amon's head. Amon ducked low, drew his rifle in one smooth motion, and fired. The man toppled from his horse, hitting the dirt with a thud that silenced the wind. Clyde cursed, wheeling his horse around. The second gunman pulled his trigger too slow. Amon's second shot caught him square in the chest. Akacheta dropped to the ground, hands over her head, heart hammering against the earth. The laundry flapped like ghosts between her and the fight. Clyde fired wildly, one bullet grazing Amon's shoulder, another shattering the wagon wheel behind him. Blood blossomed on Amon's shirt, dark and spreading fast. But he stood firm, eyes locked on the man who had sold a woman like livestock. Clyde spat into the dust. "You think you're some kind of savior, Thorne? She ain't like you. She's Apache, wild. You can't tame that." Amon's jaw clenched, his rifle steady. "I ain't trying to." He fired once more. The bullet hit Clyde's arm, spinning him sideways in the saddle. The man howled, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You'll pay for this!" Clyde shouted, his voice cracking as he turned his horse. "You hear me? You'll rot for this!" He kicked the horse hard, bolting into the open plains. The last glimpse of him was a dark shape swallowed by the storm of dust he left behind. Silence fell hard and heavy. Akacheta ran to Amon, her hands trembling as she pressed against the wound on his shoulder. Blood soaked through her fingers, warm and frightening. "You're hurt," she said, her voice breaking. Amon gave a weak half-smile. "Had worse. That doesn't make it better." He exhaled slowly, leaning into her touch, the rifle slipping from his grasp. "I told you," he murmured. "This land ain't kind to those who care." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held his gaze steady. "Then we'll teach it to be." That night, rain drifted in thin, cold sheets, washing the blood from the porch boards. Akacheta sat beside the fire, cleaning his wound, the scent of whiskey and smoke thick in the air. Amon watched her in silence. The way her hands worked, gentle, patient, unshaken, made something deep inside him ache. "You should have run," he said softly. She met his eyes. "And leave you to fight alone?" He wanted to argue, but the words stuck. No one had ever stayed before, not since the fire. Outside, thunder rolled far off in the hills, a tired growl echoing across the plains. Akacheta finished binding the wound and sat back, exhausted. The lamplight caught the wet sheen in her eyes, and for a moment, he saw her not as the girl traded for a horse, but as something far stronger, a soul carved by loss but still standing. He reached out, brushing his hand against hers. "You did good, Akacheta." Her lips trembled, the words coming quiet. "So did you." They stayed that way for a long time. Two people who'd survived too much, sitting close enough to feel each other's warmth, neither daring to move. Before dawn, Amon woke to the sound of her singing, a low, haunting tune in the Apache tongue, the kind of song that felt older than words, older than grief. He listened from the doorway, his shoulder burning, his heart unsteady. When she noticed him, she didn't stop singing. She just looked at him through the firelight, eyes dark and steady. And Amon, for the first time in years, didn't feel like the last man left alive in Red Hollow. Out in the gray horizon, the wind began to rise again, but softer now, as if it too was learning what it meant to be gentle. Winter came down hard on Red Hollow that year. By December, the wind blew sharp enough to cut skin, and snow stacked up against the barn doors in thick, silent drifts. The world turned white and still, except for the groan of old timbers and the crack of frost on the windows. Akacheta rose early as always, lighting the stove before dawn, feeding the horses while her breath smoked in the air. But lately the cold seemed to cling deeper in her bones. Her hands shook when she carried water, and sometimes the world tilted under her feet for no reason. Amon noticed first. He saw the way her steps slowed, the way she leaned against the wall when she thought he wasn't looking. One morning when she came in pale and sweating after chopping wood, he set the axe aside and said quietly, "That's enough work for today." She started to protest, but his tone left no room. "I said enough." He helped her sit, fetched her water, and frowned at the heat on her skin. "You're running yourself ragged." "I'm fine," she murmured, "just tired." Tired ain't supposed to look like that. But she smiled, that soft, stubborn smile he knew too well. "You worry too much, Amon Thorne." Maybe he did, because something in him already knew what his head didn't. By the end of the week, snow swallowed the land whole. The road to town vanished under white dunes, and even the wind seemed to move slower, heavy with cold. Akacheta spent more time by the fire, wrapped in a quilt, her face lit by the orange glow. One morning she didn't come out of her room. Amon found her sitting on the bed, staring at her hands as though they'd turned to strangers. She was quiet, too quiet, and her skin was pale as linen. "I sent word to Marla," he said gently. "She'll be here soon?" Akacheta didn't answer. She looked at him with eyes full of something he couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or wonder. When the door opened that afternoon, Marla Dune, the healer from town, came stomping in, shaking snow from her shawl. She was a small woman with a voice like gravel and hands that knew more than books ever could. She pressed her palm to Akacheta's wrist, then smiled slow. "Well, child," she said, "you're carrying more than hope." Akacheta blinked, uncertain she'd heard right. "What do you mean?" Marla chuckled softly. "You're carrying life." The words didn't land at first. They hung in the air, drifting like snowflakes between disbelief and miracle. Akacheta's lips parted, but no sound came. She had been called many things in her life, wild, savage, broken, but never this. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Marla's eyes warmed. "As sure as I'm standing here." When the door closed behind the healer, the cabin felt impossibly still. The fire popped, snow whispered against the glass, and Akacheta sat there, hand pressed to her stomach, feeling a pulse that wasn't hers alone. Amon stood by the window, his shadow long across the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled like something fragile. "Amon," he turned, and in her face he saw the truth before she said it. "I'm with child." For a moment, neither moved. The wind outside howled low and mournful, pressing against the house. Then he stepped closer, eyes wide with disbelief that softened into awe. She waited for anger or fear, or the quiet kind of rejection she'd come to know from men who couldn't bear what life demanded. But Amon Thorne did something she hadn't expected. He smiled, and then, slowly, quietly, he began to cry. Tears traced through the dust on his weathered cheeks, catching in the creases carved by years of sun and sorrow. He sat beside her, his large hand covering hers. "I never thought I'd have a reason to build again," he said. Her throat tightened. "You've built plenty already." He shook his head, gaze falling on the small Apache charm she left on the table, the one she wore the day they met. It was a leather strap strung with bone and a small turquoise bead. He picked it up, thumb brushing the worn edge. "Not like this," he said softly. This is building from hope, not from loss." He kissed her hand, rough lips against soft skin. And for the first time since the fire, Amon Thorne's heart didn't ache. It beat. That night, while the snow thickened outside, Amon pulled an old crate of tools from the corner. He sat up by the fire, the lamplight painting his face gold and tired. From the woodpile, he chose a block of pine, smooth, solid, patient. Akacheta watched from the bed, the blanket pulled over her knees. "What are you doing?" "Something I should have done long ago," he said. He drew his knife across the wood, each stroke slow, careful. The sound of carving filled the room, steady as breathing. Chips fell like pale feathers onto the floor. After a while, she realized what he was making. A cradle. Small, curved, shaped with the kind of tenderness a man didn't show the world. When he paused, she said softly, "You believe it'll live? That we'll make it through?" He didn't look up. "I have to." The knife scraped again, steady and sure. "Because if I don't believe that, this land wins." She smiled faintly, eyes glimmering in the light. "And you don't like to lose." He chuckled, a deep, rough sound that felt almost like warmth. By dawn, the snow had stopped, and the cradle stood finished by the fire. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in Red Hollow ever was, but it was strong, honest, and made by hand. Amon brushed the dust from his palms, stepped back, and stared at what he'd made. Akacheta rose, moving slow, her feet bare on the wooden floor. She stood beside him, one hand resting on her belly, the other finding his. Outside, the world gleamed white under the morning sun. "Do you think it'll be a boy or girl?" he asked. She smiled, eyes soft. "Doesn't matter. It's already a miracle. He nodded. That it is. They stood there for a long moment, two souls who had survived too much, now standing in the quiet glow of something new. And in the heart of that frozen land, beneath all the ruin and silence, a tiny spark of life began to beat, proof that even the hardest soil could still give birth to grace. Winter never really left Red Hollow. It just hid beneath the crust of snow, waiting. The air had that sharp edge again, the kind that bit at the lungs and whispered bad news across the plains. Amon felt it before he saw it. Trouble always had a sound, a rhythm to the hooves, a way the wind went still before hell came riding. He was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard the horses. 3 riders this time, not drunk or reckless like before. This was slower, colder, purposeful. Clyde Marin led them, his arms still bound from the last fight, his face meaner, thinner, and beside him, wrapped in a wolfskin coat, rode a man Amon didn't recognize. Until Apache stepped onto the porch and froze. Her lips parted, the color drained from her cheeks. "It's him," she whispered, "the one who burned our village." The older man dismounted with the calm of someone who'd forgotten what mercy was. His hair was white, his eyes pale as river ice. "You've grown, girl," he said, voice cracked like old bark. "Didn't think I'd find you playing house with a rancher." Amon moved to stand in front of her, his hand brushing hers just long enough to steady her. "You found her. Now leave." The old man smiled. "I came for what's mine. You took my property once. I aim to collect it back." The words hit Amon like a nail driven deep. He knew there'd be no talking this time. He could see it in the man's eyes, the same look he'd seen in the mirror once, when he'd lost everything. He turned to Akacheta, his voice low and certain. "Lock the door. Keep the lamp low. If I don't come back by dawn, ride east." She grabbed his arm. "No!" He cupped her face, the rough of his thumb against her cheek. "Please, don't make me say goodbye twice." Then he kissed her forehead, lingering there like a prayer that had nowhere left to go. By the time he saddled up, the storm had begun. Snow falling in wild, slanting sheets, wind screaming between the trees. The riders were already halfway up the ridge. Amon followed. His horse fought against the wind, hooves sinking into the drifts. The forest loomed black and skeletal around him. Somewhere ahead, a crow called once, then was swallowed by the storm. He found them near the river bend, a clearing lit by flashes of lightning, white against the dark. Clyde turned, grinning through the snow. "Well, Thorne," he called, voice slurred but eager. "Didn't expect you to come chasing us into the woods like some fool hero." Amon's reply was flat, almost tender. "Didn't expect you to keep breathing this long." Then the world split open. Gunfire tore through the trees, echoing like thunder between the cliffs. Amon dove behind a stump, returning fire in tight, measured bursts. One bullet caught Clyde's hat, spinning it into the snow. Another grazed Amon's shoulder, heat slicing through the cold. The old man shouted something, words lost in the storm, and fired again. The shot cracked past Amon's ear, splintering bark inches from his head. Snow churned, blood mixing with it in dark streaks. The air stank of powder and pine. Amon moved from cover, eyes narrowing through the blur. He fired once, twice. Clyde jerked in the saddle, fell backward, and didn't rise again. Only the old man remained. He stood in the open now, chest heaving, pistol shaking in his hand. "You think she's yours to save?" He spat. "She'll always be what she is, a curse." Amon stepped closer, voice steady. "Then I'll carry it." The man fired. The sound cracked across the clearing like a whip. Amon's shot answered a heartbeat later. Both men staggered. For a second, the world went still. Two silhouettes frozen in a snowstorm, both bleeding, both too stubborn to fall first. Then the old man dropped to his knees, snow blooming red around him. Amon swayed, clutching his side. The pain was deep, hot, and wrong. He pressed his hand against it, feeling the blood come fast. Still, he stayed on his feet long enough to reach his horse. The ride back was a blur. Snow lashed at his face, the wind clawing his breath away. Every hoofbeat sounded farther apart, every breath heavier. He thought of her, the way she'd laughed once, soft and shy. the way she'd rested her hand on his chest as if to remind him he still had a heart. He held on to that. When he saw the faint light of the cabin, he almost didn't believe it was real. He slid from the saddle, half falling into the snow. His vision tunneled, the world fading to the sound of her voice calling his name. The door burst open. Akacheta ran out barefoot, the lamp trembling in her hand, snow swirling around her like wings. She dropped to her knees beside him, pulling him close, her tears turning to frost on his coat. "You came back," she breathed, voice breaking. Amon managed a small, tired smile, his breath fogged between them. "I always would." She pressed her forehead to his, whispering words in Apache that he didn't understand, but somehow felt. The storm howled around them, relentless and wild. But for that moment, in the middle of the white fury, there was peace. She dragged him inside, blood trailing across the threshold. The firelight flickered over his face, lined, scarred, and still beautiful in the way the land could be when it finally stopped fighting. He looked at her one last time, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You teach this land to be kind, hear me?" Her tears fell on his chest as she nodded. Outside, the wind eased. The snow slowed. The world at last was quiet. And in that silence, Amon Thorne's promise lived on, etched into the land itself, into every breath of wind that crossed Red Hollow, and into the heart of the woman who refused to let it die. Spring came slow to Red Hollow, as if the earth itself wasn't sure it deserved another chance. For months, the snow melted in hesitant trickles, then gave way to the soft breath of wind that carried the scent of sage and wet soil. The world that had been white and cruel turned green again, shyly at first, then all at once. Inside the cabin, life stirred in the most fragile of ways. The cry of a newborn filled the morning, raw, small, and miraculous. Akacheta wept when she heard it, not from pain but from awe. In her arms lay a baby girl, tiny as a sparrow and red as dawn. Amon knelt beside her, his rough hands trembling as he brushed the child's cheek. "Hope," he whispered. "Hope Thorne." Akacheta smiled through tears. "Hope," she repeated, tasting the name like prayer. Outside, the wind whistled through the cottonwoods, carrying the sound of that first cry far across the plain. Amon healed slowly from his wounds, though he still moved with a stiffness that came and went with the weather. He built again, because he needed to. The barn rose from its ashes under his hands, the smell of sawdust and cedar mixing with the faint sweetness of milk and baby breath from the house. Every evening, after he'd finished hammering, he'd stop by the doorway. Inside, Akacheta rocked the baby by the fire, humming the same low, ancient song she used to calm the horses. Hope's small fingers would curl around her mother's braid, and Amon would stand there quietly, hat in hand, feeling something like peace settle deep into his bones. He'd seen enough of the world to know peace never lasted. But this one, this little piece of it, felt earned. The ranch was simpler now. They didn't need much. Akacheta planted herbs behind the cabin, yarrow, chamomile, a patch of mint that fought through the rocky soil like it was born stubborn. She traded medicine with the folks in town who'd finally stopped calling her the Apache woman and started calling her Miss Thorne. Amon spent his days tending the horses, the ones he and Akacheta had saved from the storm years before. He'd talk to them like old friends, cussing at them gently when they were ornery, patting their necks when they worked well. Sometimes when he'd pass the old corral, he'd stop beside a small wooden cross buried half in the grass. The wind there always felt different, kinder somehow, as if the land itself remembered his promise. As the seasons turned, hope grew strong. She had Akacheta's dark eyes and Amon's unshakable calm. She'd toddle after her father, barefoot in the dirt, a laugh that could break even the hardest day. One afternoon, Amon sat carving a small horse from a piece of driftwood, the same way he had years ago for his first son. Hope climbed onto his knee, curious. "What's that, Papa?" He smiled, running the blade slow and careful. "Something for you. Your ma says you got the spirit of a rider." Akacheta watched from the doorway, arms crossed, heart swelling in that quiet, aching way mothers feel when the world seems too beautiful to trust. When the carving was done, he handed it to Hope. "See? Stands tall, even when the wind's rough." The little girl laughed, holding it tight. Like Mama? Amon chuckled. Exactly like Mama. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the world in gold, Akacheta sat by the fence, her child playing in the grass nearby. The air smelled of rain and wildflowers, the sky wide and forgiving. Amon joined her, wiping his hands on a rag, the faint smell of cedar clinging to him. They watched in silence as Hope chased a butterfly, her laughter floating through the air. After a while, Akacheta spoke softly, her voice almost carried off by the wind. I was traded for a horse once. Amon glanced at her, then out toward the horizon. Best trade this damn land ever saw. Akacheta turned to him, a tear slipping down her cheek, glinting like sunlight. You mean that? He nodded, eyes distant but warm. I do. There ain't much in this life I'd do over, but that I'd do again in a heartbeat. She reached for his hand, fingers threading through the roughness of his palm. Then I reckon we both found something worth keeping. The wind rose again, gentle this time, sweeping through the tall grass like a song. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried, a sharp, bright sound that faded into the wide silence of the plains. When night fell, Akacheta tucked Hope into her cradle, the same one Amon had carved by firelight months ago. The baby's tiny breaths filled the cabin, steady as the rhythm of the earth. Amon lit the lamp, and the glow touched every corner of their small world. The wooden walls, the herbs hanging from the rafters, the cradle, the worn hands of two people who had survived what others could not. He looked at her then, the woman he'd once thought of as a stranger bound by misfortune, and saw not what life had taken from them, but what it had given back. Akacheta's eyes met his, soft as dusk. Do you ever wonder, she asked, if the wind remembers? He smiled, pulling her close. It does, but it don't tell. She leaned into him, the fire crackling low. Outside, the moon climbed above the plains, silvering the land that had once tried to break them. Years later, folks who rode through Red Hollow would sometimes stop and ask about the ranch at the edge of the hills, the one with the herb garden and the horses that never spooked. Some said an Apache woman lived there. Others swore it was just a story. But when the wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of wild sage and smoke, it would whisper a name, Amon Thorne. And if you listened close, you could almost hear laughter in that wind, and the faint echo of a man's voice saying, best trade this land ever saw. No one remembered the bargain that started it all. Only the western wind kept telling it. The story of a girl once traded for a horse, who found something far greater, a home, a family, and